Clara looked at the mansion that had once been a symbol of status and power, with a mixture of sadness and anger. The walls that had once reflected the elegance of her father Roberto's empire now exuded decay. The old house was filled with worn-out furniture and areas that needed urgent repairs. The glass doors, once shiny and imposing, were now dusty and broken. Nothing remained of the shine that had once been the family's trademark. Failure was imprinted on every corner, and Clara felt that the weight of her father's business failure was also reflected in her soul. Roberto, the man who once ruled an empire, now found himself trapped by his own pride. He tried to keep up appearances, but the effort was increasingly visible. In meetings with the few remaining investors, he appeared tense, nervous, with a confidence that was no longer there. The lack of money made him bitter, and his impatience with Clara grew with each passing day. "Clara, go to your room. You don't belong there," he would say whenever she tried to offer a solution. He saw her as an inexperienced young woman, a daughter who knew nothing about the business world. When she suggested ways to improve the company's situation, he would dismiss her with a brusque gesture, as if her words were nothing more than wind. Clara felt the pain of being rejected, of being constantly discredited. She knew that her father did not respect her, that he saw her attempt to help as a simple whim of a young woman with no experience in the market. But something inside her could not give up. The idea of seeing her family sinking into poverty without fighting gave her no peace. However, every attempt to intervene ended up being cut off with harsh words, like a sharp blade that cut her confidence into pieces. When she finally summoned the courage to suggest selling some properties to reduce expenses, Roberto glared at her with a blank look of anger. "You don't understand anything. Nothing will save this company. We are not the same anymore. Everything I have built is crumbling, and you think selling properties will solve it?" he shouted, his words echoing through the large hall of the house. Clara, with a heavy heart, saw that there was no more room for her ideas. She sat on the sofa in the living room, watching her father, who was looking back at the spreadsheets that had now become nothing more than empty numbers, symbols of a past he could no longer reach. He was no longer the man she had admired, the man who had once been able to inspire respect. She closed her eyes and wondered, how long would she continue to be just a spectator of her own life? How long would her father see her as useless, a fragile woman with no ability to change things? The silence that followed was the heaviest of all. Clara knew that more than ever, she would need to find a way to write her own story. She could no longer allow herself to live in the shadow of her father's failed expectations. But at that moment, something inside Clara began to change. She didn't know what it was, but she knew that something inside her was preparing for a change. What had previously seemed impossible now began to take shape as a possibility, albeit a distant one. The clock on the wall marked the beginning of a busy afternoon. Clara was sitting in a conference room in the office of her father's old company, a place she barely recognized. The air was thick with tension, and she felt that something was about to happen. Roberto, nervous as ever, was talking to a few investors who still seemed willing to help. The room, once filled with excitement and hope, now exuded uncertainty and despair. "We need a turnaround, and fast. We can't go on like this. The company can't just be a name in the market. It needs to become relevant again," Roberto said, trying to keep his voice steady, but Clara could hear the tremor that escaped his words. He was desperately trying to show that he still had control of the situation, but everyone there knew that wasn't true. The investors, silent, exchanged skeptical glances. The conversation was losing momentum, and what had once seemed like a lifeline was quickly turning into yet another imminent failure. Clara, albeit in the background, was watching everything closely. She knew that the situation required a creative solution, something unconventional. She had spent nights studying alternative business models, attended lectures on innovation, and learned what she could about the market. However, her father never let her actively participate in the discussions. He saw her as a secondary figure, someone who could add nothing of value. She then decided that she would speak up. She stood up discreetly and, with a determined look, interrupted the conversation. "If you'll allow me, I think we have an opportunity to reposition ourselves in the market in a unique way, taking advantage of current trends in sustainability and innovation," Clara began, her voice calm but firm. But as soon as she finished speaking, Roberto interrupted her with a brusque gesture. He looked at her as if she were a child who didn't know what she was saying. "Clara, stop. This isn't your place. I'm the one who understands business here, not you," he said, and the room fell silent for a moment, all eyes now on Clara. The humiliation came like a blow. He had publicly belittled her, making it clear to everyone there that she had no credibility, that her ideas had no value whatsoever. Clara felt her face heat up, and a lump in her throat instantly formed. She didn't know what hurt more, the humiliation of being disregarded or the fact that her father saw her as insignificant. The investors, unsure of how to react, exchanged uncomfortable glances. Some tried to look away, others just fiddled with their notes. Clara, frozen in her place, felt tears threatening to fall, but she didn't let them. She took a deep breath, controlling her emotions, but the pain was too great. She didn't want to be there anymore. A feeling of helplessness took over her body, but she knew she had to resist. She slowly stood up and, with a choked voice, said, "I'm sorry, but I don't think the solution is here anymore. I have to go." Without waiting for an answer, she left the room. The path to the door seemed endless, as if each step was a heavier burden than the last. As she walked down the hallway, Clara felt a mixture of frustration, sadness, and anger. How could her own father treat her that way? How could he not see what she was trying to do? What she wanted most now was to escape that house, that burden, and everything she had endured up until that point. But what Clara didn't know was that this humiliation, this moment of deep pain, would be the seed that would germinate her transformation. Something inside her was ignited at that moment, something that would make her no longer submit, no longer wait for anyone's approval. Failure would no longer be a burden, but an opportunity to start over. She paused at the door, took one last look back, and before she left, she made a silent promise to herself. She would get back up no matter how long or hard it took. She would find her own strength and prove herself capable, not just to her father, but to herself. After leaving the room, Clara walked quickly through the office corridors, her footsteps echoing in her mind, each one heavier than the last. She knew that this could not be the end. What she had experienced was humiliating, but it was not the end of her story, not by any means. That morning, Clara made the decision not to let herself be consumed by pain and helplessness. It was time to act, to find the way out that seemed so far away, but was within her reach. She no longer wanted to depend on her father's approval or anyone else's. She wanted to do it for herself. She drove to the city, and as she drove, her mind was racing. Clara knew that despite the failure, there was a gap, a possibility to rebuild the company, but also to win herself back. What she needed was to find the right direction, a solution that went beyond the traditional. She knew it wouldn't be easy, that the world wouldn't accept her without question, but the humiliation had transformed her into something different, something strong, determined, resilient. When she parked her car, Clara realized she had arrived at a small cafe in the city center, a simple but welcoming place that she had never been to before. She got out and went inside, looking for a break to gather her thoughts. Looking around, she noticed that the cafe was almost empty, except for a table where a man was sitting. He seemed absorbed in a book, and there was something enigmatic in his expression. Clara felt a sudden curiosity, but quickly pushed the thought away. What she wanted most at that moment was to be alone, without any more distractions. She made the request, and as she waited, the man's gaze met hers. He seemed to study Clara with deep interest, almost as if he knew what she was thinking. He smiled slightly, as if he had somehow understood what was going on inside her. Clara, not knowing how to react, smiled back, but kept her distance. She wasn't there for unnecessary conversation. She needed time for herself. It was then that he approached her desk with unusual kindness. "May I sit down? You seem to have something on your mind, and I know that sometimes the best way to organize your thoughts is to share them with someone." His voice was calm, almost soothing, and Clara couldn't help but feel a strange sensation, as if she were being pulled by something beyond simple curiosity. She hesitated, but something inside her made her accept. "Sure, you can sit down." The man sat down in the chair next to her and, with disconcerting ease, began to talk about topics that Clara would never have imagined someone would approach with such lightness and wisdom. He spoke about changes, about difficult times and the beauty of reinventing oneself. "You're going through a difficult time, aren't you?" he asked with a smile. Clara was surprised. How did he know that? It was as if he had read her soul. "How do you know that?" Clara asked, still trying to understand the feeling of familiarity that emanated from that stranger. "I can feel the weight of your soul, the silent struggle in your eyes. I've been through something similar, and I can see that the answer is within you, even if you don't know it yet," he replied unhurriedly, with a calmness that made Clara feel disconcerted. The conversation went on for hours. The man, named Hugo, was not one to give ready-made solutions or easy answers. He talked about the importance of looking inside yourself and understanding what you really want. He talked about having the courage to take the next step, even without knowing what the future will bring. He mentioned that in times of crisis, the biggest mistake is to try to hold on to what you have and resist change. The secret, he said, was to give up control and accept the unknown, because it is in the unknown that true freedom is found. Clara was attentive, listening with an open mind, something she rarely did before. With each word, she felt her mind expand, new possibilities being revealed. Hugo was not just some random stranger. He seemed to be the key to something Clara did not yet fully understand. "You need to take the next step, Clara. Don't let fear of the future control you. Look at yourself and ask, what do you really want?" Hugo asked, his voice soft but firm. Clara took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words. What did she really want? The answer was still hazy, but something inside her had begun to change. Hugo smiled again, stood up, and before leaving left one last message. "Change doesn't happen from the outside in, Clara. It comes from the inside out. When you understand yourself, the world around you will begin to change too." Clara stood there, alone, reflecting. The day had changed. It was no longer about her father's empire. It was no longer about her failed attempts to please someone who had never understood her. Now, it was all about her. Clara knew the road ahead would be hard, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had found a direction, and more importantly, she had found the strength to keep going. The following days were a mix of uncertainty and renewed motivation. Clara could not deny that the meeting with Hugo had touched her deeply. His words echoed in her mind like a soft and constant echo, reminding her that true change did not come from external forces, but from the ability to reinvent herself. She knew there was still much work to do, but a flame was lit inside her, an energy that could not be ignored. In her daily routine, Clara began to act with more confidence. She reviewed all the company documents, delved into alternative strategies, and read about new forms of leadership and innovation. With each book she read, each article she studied, she felt more prepared to face the challenge. And despite the initial discomfort, she allowed herself to abandon what she previously believed to be the right path. The idea of following the same business model as the previous management, simply to keep things moving, was replaced by something bolder. Clara knew she needed more than just running the company. She needed a quiet revolution, a change in the heart of the company, and most of all, in herself. She decided she would make no more compromises. The days of hiding behind her father's shadow were over. A week after her meeting with Hugo, Clara began gathering some of her father's former collaborators, people she trusted, but also those who were willing to go beyond the conventional. She knew it would take a concerted effort, but she felt the time to act had come. She sat down with each of them, discussed their visions, and quickly realized that they were more willing to believe in her than she had imagined. That morning, Clara decided to hold a meeting with her investors. It would no longer be a desperate meeting to save the company, but a presentation of her new, bold and different plan. There was no room for fear or insecurity. Her new goal was clear: to transform the company into something sustainable, innovative, with an absolute focus on social impact and environmental respect. It was a model that challenged traditional standards, but it was exactly what she believed was the key to the future. As she prepared, Clara looked out her office window, watching the city hustle and bustle. It was as if the world was moving faster around her, but she was focused. Deep inside, she knew she had the power to change the direction of things. She no longer needed her father's approval, nor the old formulas he had followed. From that moment on, she would be the leader of her own story. The investor meeting took place late in the afternoon, and Clara was nervous but determined. She walked into the room with a confident posture, dressed simply but elegantly, with nothing to hide. She knew that the key was not in what she was wearing, but in the energy she emanated. Every word she said seemed to be accompanied by an inner strength that surprised even the most skeptical investors. Clara explained her new plan clearly, addressing the issues of innovation, sustainability, and above all, the desire to build something that would be relevant for the future. She spoke not only of numbers and projections, but of values, impact, and a new vision for the market. At the end, she sat down, waiting for their reaction. The silence in the room seemed endless. Clara felt her heart race, but she didn't look away. When one of the investors finally spoke, he wasn't negative. On the contrary, he seemed interested, perhaps even impressed. "It's a bold model, Clara. We won't deny that. But there's something about your vision that really catches our attention. If you truly believe in it, we can walk alongside you." It was the beginning of a change, and Clara felt the transformation taking place within her. Confidence no longer came from the recognition of others, but from her own inner strength, from her ability to turn difficulties into opportunities. She knew it would not be easy, but now she was ready to follow her path. Nothing would stop her. Clara's success at the investor meeting brought a wave of renewed enthusiasm. She knew this was just the beginning, but something inside her had already shifted. What had seemed impossible was now within reach. Her innovative strategy was beginning to come to life, and with it, a sense of accomplishment she had never experienced before. But as the company gained momentum, Clara also faced the challenges of being seen as a legitimate leader without the protective shadow of her father. In the first few months that followed, the company's growth continued steadily. Clara threw herself into it body and soul, adjusting processes, creating a new corporate culture focused on collaboration, innovation, and above all, respect for sustainability. But as she saw her vision become a reality, she also faced increasing pressure from high society and competitors. Many doubted her ability to lead, and those who had once seen her as the daughter of a successful businessman could no longer see beyond her initial image. It was as if she had to prove at every step that she was not there by chance. At a dinner with other business people and investors, Clara noticed the tension in the air. Discreet glances, conversations interrupted when she approached. She was the center of gossip, the subject of whispered jokes. There was no shortage of comments about her new leadership style, about the changes she was proposing, about the fact that she had been an heiress who now found herself leading a revolution. But what struck her most was the look of one of the few women present, Laura, an investor known for her ruthless stance on the market. Laura, with a smile that seemed more like a challenge, asked Clara, "So, how are you doing without your father's protection? What have you been doing to keep everything going?" The question was imbued with a sarcastic tone, a provocation disguised as concern. Clara could feel the words cutting into her like a sharp blade. But instead of giving in to resentment, she took a deep breath and answered with a firm look, "I'm doing exactly what I was always supposed to do, changing what needs to be changed, challenging the norms and striving for something more sustainable and ethical for everyone. And FYI, things are going really well, Laura." Silence fell across the table, but Clara knew that this moment had more meaning than it seemed. She had reaffirmed her authority, her ability to be an independent leader. However, the cost of this was beginning to become clear. The attacks, often veiled, were only just beginning. Doubt about her leadership and the constant comparison with her father would be a constant. However, Clara was not about to be intimidated. When the meeting ended, she walked to her car, feeling a weight on her chest. Despite her verbal victory, the discomfort continued to creep up on her. The loneliness that came with reaching the top of the mountain seemed more evident than ever. She knew she was being tested not just by others, but by herself. When she got home, Clara lay down, trying to find something to calm her mind. She thought about her father, about the expectations he had always had of her, about her failed attempts to please him. She felt that despite everything, he was still a distant presence, watching her somehow, as if waiting for her next move. She closed her eyes, and for a moment her mind went blank. But the silence brought up a question she could no longer ignore. What, after all, was she sacrificing to achieve all this? Her relationships, her inner peace. There was indeed a cost behind victory. She could already feel that the fine line between success and loneliness was being crossed, and the future now seemed to be both a promise and a threat. The weight of Clara's responsibilities seemed to increase over time, and she began to feel that the pressure was not just coming from the market, but from a much deeper and more personal source. She was increasingly disconnected from her own essence, trying to balance the success she was building with a lack of internal understanding. Her journey of overcoming had been immense, but the loneliness at the top seemed like a difficult burden to bear. Her mind was full of doubts, and in the silence of lonely nights, she often wondered if she was making the right choices. It was late one afternoon, during a meeting where she was presenting the company's progress to new investors, that an unexpected figure appeared. It was Hugo, the mentor who had given her the initial push. Clara was surprised to see him there, in the same room as her, but she couldn't help but smile. He seemed as calm and centered as ever, a presence that made her feel stronger, as if he were there to remind her of her mission. "You're doing great, Clara," Hugo said after the meeting. They stepped away from the group to talk, and the tension in the room disappeared as soon as he began to speak. "But there's still something in your past that you haven't fully confronted. The external change you're creating in the company is evident, but there's something inside you, something that needs to be addressed so that you can continue to grow." Clara looked at him in surprise. How did he know that? How could he sense something so deep within her that even she had not fully identified? She hesitated, but the truth slowly began to emerge from her mind. I don't know what you're talking about, Hugo," she replied, trying to hide her vulnerability. But he fixed her with a gaze that seemed to see right through her, right to the very depths of her soul. "You're trying to be someone you're not, Clara, and it's time for you to break free from that. Your father, the image he's built of you, the burden of being his daughter, that's your biggest obstacle. It's not your competitors, it's not the pressure of the market. You're still trying to live up to his expectations, and it's shaping your decisions in ways you don't even realize." Boy, Hugo's words hung in the air, heavy and true. Clara felt a knot tighten in her stomach, as if her own history were being laid bare before her. It was clear now what she had left behind without ever looking at it. Her father's expectations, the relentless search for approval that never came, and the need to prove herself to a man who, in his emotional absence, could never truly acknowledge her. I don't know how to change this, Hugo. I feel like I'm losing control, that other people's expectations are consuming me," Clara said, her voice breaking. Hugo looked at her sympathetically. "That's exactly where you're going wrong, Clara. Control was never the goal. What you need now is courage. Courage to face the truth about yourself, to free yourself from these invisible chains. I know you have that strength. You just need to acknowledge it." The conversation with Hugo was a turning point. While it brought profound relief, it also opened a painful wound. Clara was face to face with the reality that throughout her life she had tried to be someone she was not. She had lost herself in her father's mold, in the expectations imposed by him and by society. And now, to continue her journey, she needed to free herself from this figure. As she walked home that night, The rain fell softly over the city, and Clara felt as if she were crossing a threshold. She had to stop living to please an image of the past. The real Clara had to emerge, even if it meant breaking with everything she had known. The loneliness she felt was no longer about being alone at the top. It was about finally facing the weight of her past and learning to forgive herself for getting lost in it. She was about to start a new stage of her journey, and this time she would be herself, without the shackles of expectation, without the invisible chains. In the days that followed her conversation with Hugo, Clara delved into a deep introspection. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to stop and reflect on her life in a different way. The memories of her childhood, the harsh words of her father, the expectations he had always projected upon her, all of this began to reorganize in her mind. She realized, with clarity, that for years she had lived according to a model of success that was never truly hers. What she had now was a chance to redefine her own path. The change wouldn't be easy, she knew, but somehow she felt that she now held the key to unlocking the true version of herself, and it would no longer be a facade of success or a constant struggle to fill the voids left by other people's expectations. Clara decided that she would start from scratch, seeking not only the growth of the company, but also her own inner balance. She began to re-evaluate every decision she made. Before, her life had been driven by the need to prove something to her father, to her investors, to everyone around her. Now, she wanted to make decisions that made sense to her. What started as a journey to regain control over the company turned into a journey of self-discovery. It was during a meeting with her team that Clara had her first big revelation. She was meeting with the group of executives she had chosen to help transform the company. They were all brilliant, but Clara knew that for real change to take place, she needed to show something more than technical innovation. She needed to be authentic. During the meeting, Clara interrupted one of the managers, who was detailing plans for a new international expansion. She looked at him, then at the team, and said, "I'm seeing something very important. We're talking about the next steps for the company, about numbers, about profits, and all of that is fundamental, of course. But I want to know, what are we, as a company, actually doing for the world? How are we impacting the people around us? I want our motivation in every decision we make to be more than just profit. We need to be better, not just for ourselves, but for everyone." The room fell silent. She could see the discomfort on the faces of some of the people present. They were not used to hearing this kind of speech from a corporate leader. The pressure for quick, immediate results had always been the driving force behind the company. But Clara was changing everything, challenging their view of success. Let's stop acting like the world is a chessboard and we're the players. Let's start seeing people as the pieces that move everything, and our job is to make sure that every move they make counts. The conversation was not easy. Some of the executives looked at her with suspicion, but Clara did not let herself be shaken. She knew that she had begun a process of transformation that was deeper than anyone there could have imagined, and it would not be an easy task. She was planting the seeds of a more humane, more ethical, and more conscious corporate culture. As Clara left the meeting, she felt something new in her chest. It was as if a heavy burden had been lifted from her shoulders. Although challenges still lay ahead, she now felt that she had found a balance. The pressure of being her father's reflection had eased, and she was beginning to see herself not as a product of his expectations, but as a person with her own ideas and desires. That evening, Clara sat alone in her office, looking out the window at the city lights. She knew she had taken an important step, but the road ahead was still long. Yet something inside her had changed. The transformation she sought for the company was no longer about numbers or status. It was about being true to herself, about aligning her values with her actions. And for the first time in her life, she felt like she was finally in control of her destiny, not because she wanted to please everyone, but because she was deciding to be who she really was. The transformation that Clara had initiated in her life and in the company was still in its early stages, but something inside her was becoming stronger every day. She was beginning to embrace the authenticity and conscious leadership that she desired for the organization. However, a shadow still loomed over her. It was the past, and as she well knew, it would never stop demanding her attention until it was faced. It all began to intensify one sleepless night. Clara was alone in her house, surrounded by documents and reports that no longer interested her. She felt a restlessness in her chest, as if something was calling her to confront something that was still dormant inside her. It was the ghost of her father, the pressure from her childhood, the expectation of being someone she was not. She knew she was being driven by an internal need to deal with this. In the back of her mind, Clara knew she couldn't move on without finally facing the truth about her past. The lack of approval she had felt for so long, the silent rejection from her father, all of it needed to be confronted. The next morning, Clara picked up the phone and called the only person who could help her at this time, her mother. After years of silence and distance, Clara decided it was time to take the final step and understand the impact of her father's emotional absence on her life. She knew her mother could give her some of the answers she was still missing. The phone rang, and after a few seconds her mother's soft, familiar voice echoed through the other end of the line. "Clara, how are you, my daughter?" The longing was instantaneous. Her mother's words always had the ability to calm her inner storms, but Clara had something important to ask. "I need to know more about him, Mom, about what really happened between us, about the way he treated me. I need to understand why I always felt like I was never enough for him." Her mother's voice was silent for a moment. Clara knew this conversation wouldn't be easy. Her mother had always been the one who somehow kept the peace between her and her father, but the truth Clara sought was beyond her words. "Clara, I never wanted you to feel this way. He was always so closed off, so distant. I tried, in every way, to get him closer to you, but he was stuck in his own frustrations. He didn't know how to love you the way you needed." These words came as a shock to Clara. She had always known that her father was distant, but hearing that he was stuck in his own frustrations made Clara realize that, in some ways, he never had the chance to be the father she needed. It left her feeling a mixture of anger and sadness. Anger at the pain he had caused, and sadness at the realization that he was also a victim of his own emotional limitations. "So, everything I did, all the seeking for approval, was for nothing?" Clara asked, her voice breaking. "I tried so hard, always trying to be perfect, trying to please him, but it was never enough." "You never had to prove anything, daughter," her mother replied with a sigh. "You were enough all along, but he couldn't see it, and that's not your fault. You were always more than capable, Clara. You were always more than he could see." These words, which Clara so desperately needed to hear, fell like a balm. She felt the weight she carried in her heart lift a little, but she knew that healing was an ongoing process. The conversation with her mother didn't completely solve her, but it was an important step in understanding that her internal struggle was never about being enough. The struggle was, in fact, about recognizing that she no longer needed approval. Clara hung up the phone, feeling a little lighter, but her heart still heavy. The truth she had just heard was liberating, but painful. She was no longer the daughter trying to be perfect in the eyes of a man who could never truly see her. But at the same time, she still had to deal with the repercussions of that in her life. It was as if a cycle was closing inside her. Clara was no longer the woman who tried to please everyone, and perhaps finally she could free herself from the invisible chains of her past. That night, before going to sleep, Clara looked one last time out the window, where the city still shone in its immensity. She knew she was not alone, that the path to healing lay in accepting what she had been and allowing herself to be who she was now. She was beginning to forgive herself,